Hey everybody, what's going on? It is leap year day, leap day. It is Friday, February 29th. And today you are listening and watching the Daily AI Show live. Today we are talking about navigating the path between innovation and bias. And this was like a conversation that went nuts because of Gemini's creation of images. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but it's also just a really important topic in LLMs in general and training AI. So today with us, we have Jyunmi and Andy, and I am Beth. And we'll let you know if anybody else joins the conversation. So, Andy, do you want to orient us a little bit with this conversation?
Sure. Let me give a context window here, short context window. Pump it in there. So AIs are trained with data. GPTs that are the main architecture generative pre-trained transformers are pre-trained with data, and it's from that data that they then make predictions. So they're prediction engines, and it's been a well-known issue in machine learning for a long time that if you're training data, uh, forget about GPTs and conversational LLMs, but just even in simple regressive prediction, like if you give it some data and you say, okay, now I'm going to give you some sparse points of data and I want you to tell me what the probable classification of this is, or what's the predictive value of certain other values. If I give it a bunch of example data in its pre-training that's all focused on certain area of outcomes but is ignoring lots of others, so it's incomplete data, then the predictions will be focused on those outcomes, thinking that that is the sort of the universe of the probable outcomes.
Mhm.
Well, that's been recognized, and so there's a whole approach to saying, okay, well, let's have the gaps that are missing in this thing. Let's fill it in with synthetic data, or we can find more data in the world that represents these missing representations. Now, put that into the enormous process of doing pre-training for these very large language models, and that's ingesting trillions of data points from all kinds of sources, but all those sources are human generated on the
Right.
web. Okay, so there's inherent bias in what is collected. There's also an enormous bias because the major large language models are being trained on a lot of English language and sort of Western civilization oriented information. Now that's not true of the Chinese models, but the ones that we're accustomed to using have an inherent bias just because they're looking at data that's been spewed out there over decades. Uh, since the beginning of the internet, to reflect what the then or general um, attitudes or or beliefs sets of humans are.
Right.
So now we get to the general problem that we're seeing today, where large language models are generating a lot of additional content. And
Mhm.
there's the possibility of reinforcing these stereotypes because now much of the data is being driven by an already biased model. So let me give you some examples of what that bias is. So take, for example, racial bias in healthcare data. So
Mhm.
it's well known that the black population has worse outcomes for the exact same conditions with the exact same DNA. That, and why is that? Well, it's because there's an inherent racial bias in the medical community that's grown up from the acculturation, and now the outcomes for those ethnicities are being biased by the AI because they're only looking back retrospectively to the historical data of how healthcare was actually practiced. So that's an example of racial bias. There's gender bias in hiring. That's a very big area that's of concern. Uh, your hiring algorithms are in the models evaluating resumes, and they can determine that this person even though the name is Chase, we don't know the exact gender of that person. There's other factors in that make the algorithm say this is a female applicant. And based on my review of history in our company, because before the advent of AI, we have been hiring people with a bias towards males. Well, our data is biased, and so the AI is going to make decisions that are biased. And
Mhm.
then another example, and then I'll move on to another point, is location bias. You can be classified by AI just based on where you live.
Right.
And think back to redlining and how that's created a probably racial oriented but also socioeconomic oriented bias in the data just based on your zip code, for example. Okay, so very recently, the like in the past month or so, the Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU put out a report on bias in algorithms and discrimination in AI as a result of that. And I'll give you just one little snippet from that report that I just read this morning, which is I didn't read the report this morning. I read the snippet. Okay, let's be clear. Um, they did an analysis of the language models that are foundation models in German, in English, and other languages.
Mhm.
And the word refugee in English is not classified by that AI as an offensive term. But in German, it was an offensive term. And I can imagine why. I mean, Germany is
Yep.
a main destination for all Middle East and North African migration. In and those immigrants are looking for refuge, and so they become refugees, and they're then classified by that language model as being, like if I call you a refugee, it's a nasty thing. So there you go.
Mm.
That's kind of the opener to the discussion, and I'll ask you guys to fill in.
Well, I think one thing is super clear is that bias is not something that you can get away from in data or large language models or AI training. And therefore, it is, as we said, navigating the path because because it is about a balancing of trying to find, and it's an imperfect balancing, right? It's
Mhm.
absolutely going to be an imperfect balancing, and so it's an ongoing thing. It's not like you can write a regulation and now there's no bias, or um it's an acceptable bias for the people in power, right? Like, I mean,
Mhm.
there's just like a ton of sticky complicated points that go into this, but it is still really important to grapple with, because bias also includes safety and alignment, right? So when we talk about um, the coming transformation that's happening in society, and work, and all of the all of the nouns that you would put at the end of that, um, those are mitigated or prepared for, or a slower on ramp based on the decisions of alignment that happen. And alignment is bias, right? Like, something is aligned or not aligned.
Mm.
That is a discernment decision. All
Mhm.
right, that's my take, Junie.
So, Beth, I agree. I think you have a really good point there, and especially to highlight the point that this is going to be this is an ongoing battle, right? This is not, like you said, it's not something that we'll figure out what the trick is and then AI will be magically fixed from bias. It's something that we have to consider from the get go, from the beginning, when training, when building, when using AI, and specifically LLMs in this case. What I did want to focus on are some possible um, ways that we can mitigate bias in AI. And
Mhm.
so a few things that I was able to look up is, number one, we can test it in the testing of the algorithms. We can put in real life scenarios and real life settings, right? Um, we want to identify those biases through those real life scenarios. Another thing we can do is we can use counterfactual fairness in evaluating the impact, right? Depending on what kind of biases there's against groups and things like that. And we can mitigate using that method. And the one that we talk about a lot is human in the loop,
Right.
right? And that human in the loop is great for every stage of AI development and use, right? Uh, from a business standpoint, you do not want to skip the human in part of the process, because then you get some real crazy output, and you just lose uh, that element of control and security in what the final product is. So human in the loop at every single stage, I think is wise to consider. As AI systems develop, there may be uh, more responsibility that's put on the AI systems, but we should never not have a human at least analyzing what's going out for various reasons, and in this context, bias. Um, Another aspect to look at it, I think, is also modifying how we approach the foundational systems. Not necessarily talking about foundational AI, but how we approach education and and just knowledge or literacy, right? In this case, science and technology literacy, much like we advocate for media literacy, AI literacy, just educating people from as early as early in their learning or development stages, so that they have a critical eye when it comes to developing or moving forward, in specifically here in science and technology. So if you can teach people the skills to analyze things effectively earlier, then that can correspond to advancements or changes down the line,
Well,
right?
good luck in the world where, at least here in the United States, where diversity, equity, and inclusion, which would be a fundamental component of such an education, are being removed from curricula. And that's like the counter wave here. And I think there is a counterpoint to this, which is, hey, let's ignore the past. Let's just look at the reality as it is today. And what the AI is biased about is really just what is. And so I've heard this articulated
Mm-hmm.
as a complaint about the idea that we need to correct bias towards a specific set of mores. And so to get to that, let's just remember that in image generation, this is an area where it surfaces to the attention of the press and elsewhere, and very recently, because of Google's image
Mm-hmm.
generator, being found to be, you know, seriously biased towards, multi-ethnic representations rather than even being able to include, a majority ethnic population in one of its results. Uh,
Right.
Skirting
Or
here the actual specifics, but maybe
historic accuracy, right?
Right.
that's right. Yeah.
In
So
the basic.
this happened, for Google most recently, and I'll make a comment about how I think that happened. Um, and the other thing is that there was already in DALI 3,
Yes.
an instruction that's not in the pre-training, but was added by the developers to say, when you're when you're responding to a prompt, then we want you to include some ethnic variations in the imagery. And if you recall, in the days when you get 4 images back, it would provide 4 images, at least one of which was taking the prompt that you did and adding like a Latina visualization of a female character that you'd asked for to be present in the thing, or an Asian representation in there, and that wasn't a part of your prompt at all, but it was being told with the system prompts that were provided
Mm-hmm.
by the purveyor of the large language model, OpenAI in this case, is being said, okay, let's make sure that we have some diversity in here. So it had a
Mm-hmm.
diversity override. Now, fast forward to today when Google launched its very, very competent models, but they didn't have anything more than that kind of brute force post-training instruction set that said, make sure you're completely diverse on this, and maybe with a slant towards inclusion of all kinds of diverse ethnicities when you're generating an image. And that led to people sort of red teaming that image generator and asking specifically for an image of a 1943 German soldier.
Right.
And you've probably seen this in the press. All of you who are watching this show anyway have. And what it came out with was German soldiers, in multiple ethnicities, none of which were German. So,
Right.
that's the problem of bias. And so they turned it off. They turned it off, and now they're going to go more thoughtfully
They turned
at how.
image generation off.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
turned
Yeah,
image.
image
Right,
generator. Yeah, that's right.
right. Well,
Completely. So they turned off their
yeah.
whole service because their override instruction was doing something that was really kind of biased in the wrong direction.
And
Well, I
to be
think
fair,
what you really point out. Oh,
go
sorry.
ahead.
Go ahead, Beth.
I was just going to say, to be fair, Google has been obviously wrestling with this for a while, because prior to this, it would not engage with you about images that had faces, right? Like it is not. It would not generate images with faces. If you gave it a doll, you would need to explain, yes, it has a face, but it's not a human, it's a doll, right? Like I think we can talk about it.
Right.
And so clearly there was evidence coming up to this, that this was something that they were wrestling with. And I think we just saw the bleed out. Jyunmi.
Right. Well, I was just going to point out, Andy, like your examples are perfect. I think we need to highlight the fact that both OpenAI and Google's approach was an after the fact approach. Right. They
Right.
tried to use their own system prompts to either force a diverse look, or to mitigate their data bias, right? Their data set bias, the things that their AI systems are built off of, their models are built off of. So, it. I think what we really got to like approach this from let's start this from the beginning, right? Let's apply these bias mitigating steps from the beginning in when we develop these models. So they're kind of playing catch up with, this is what we got. Oh, now let's try and stick a band-aid on it or whatnot. So if Gemini, the debacle with Gemini image generation does anything, I think it brings or highlights the fact that the basic data set needs to be bias needs to be mitigated, or that step needs to have more attention to it. And there was one other point that I was coming up with. Thank you, Perplexity. That the idea of data integrity, right? So cleaning up the data, because crap in, crap out, and we've seen these big blowups because of it. And two, diversifying the AI teams themselves. Because when you
Yes.
have people who have different life experiences from different places, that insight, having more eyes and brains on a problem, can provide you more a greater data set. They can apply their own life experiences to it and notice things that people who have their own inherent biases from who they are and how they grew up can be blind to, right? So when
Right.
more is better, you know mix more into the pot because it can only come out better because you have all of these perspectives.
And
So
it's a question of the
yeah,
weights. And when you're doing this mix, this virtuous
yeah,
mix of data that's going to be included, and the question is how much of each one is fairly added to the pot in order to make it representative of the broad, diversity of the humans on the globe. So this gets to a sort of a meta level bias that's in AI
yeah.
as a result of the sort of the main prongs of AI development being in the English language, nations
Hmm.
of the UK and the United States and Canada and so on, Australia. There's centers of excellence and all those that have basically focused on English language data for language model training. And then you have another locus in China. I believe it's in Mandarin that their systems
Hmm.
are being operated, along with their character representation of language for their text inputs and outputs. So you have those two, but there's a bunch of different philosophies and cultures and so on out there that have no representation in the data or a very small representation in the data. And
Right.
so, how do you get when you ask a question about a culture? We've run into this recently where we're trying to find a capable large language model that doesn't have a lack of facility with an unusual language rather than one of the main ones. Many of these large language models can translate between and among 35 different languages, but the training sets for the lesser languages, with English and Chinese being the first two, probably German, Spanish, etc. Uh, you know, the other languages and the other cultures, they just haven't had enough data ingested about them to have a fair
Right.
representation of their distinct and diverse ways of thinking, ways of believing, and all of that. So we've biased the world of AI, which is now being propagated out there, just like US media culture is propagated out there because we have Hollywood. Uh, there's enormous bias culturally on the planet as a result of that. That's the meta view of bias.
Right.
Yeah, it's definitely highlights the potential issues or the potential points of thought that we have to analyze, and this may develop into a larger section of AI development is philosophy towards AI or human philosophy towards AI, and of course expanding out the ethical implications.
Right. Right. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that as a country, I would say that the US has not um, engaged with our past in the same to the same depth, let's say, that Germany did or Japan did, right? So like there have been things that have happened in our past that we still are complicated. So like the whole idea of woke US history being something that actually just states facts about slavery, it is I mean, like, okay, but, it happened, right? Like, I mean, and that,
Uh,
like, there can be a
and
controversy about whether the Holocaust happened, but that is not a controversy in Germany, which totally knew that it happened, and actually it's a part of their history. It's a part of, like, known shared fact. There can be opinions about it, but it
yeah.
isn't about existence or not. And so I think this, because again, it's there's a big US bias in this context. I think that is playing itself out in this as well.
Yeah, we haven't had a truth and reconciliation process in the United States, and instead there's
Mm.
been a political force that's allowed a perpetuation of long-term white supremacist views, and colonialist views, and that's just a fact. And now there are forces at play today that want to try to suppress any revisitation of the realities of what happened in our past and instead focus on just what is today. And that's a little Pollyanna in my view. I think it's more important that there be broader and more diverse education. That's a personal opinion. Um,
Well,
but yeah, we're wrestling with that.
like we totally are, and I think the world is to a certain extent as well. Again, I think that there are different weights in terms of like how open your culture has been to how much the culture has told a similar story, um, uh, and who is dominant in your culture, and blah, 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 blah. But I do think that this is that one of the most important things in terms of the stories that we tell ourselves that are coming out of this is the tension between the story that existed in your past, which is what your data is trained on, because data is past data or it's synthetic data, generally made in the pattern of your past data, right? Or intentionally made in a slightly different pattern. You
Unfortunately, the
have
past, the data about the past underrepresents the oppressed elements of a society, right?
right.
It's the winners and the survivors, who become dominant, who write history. So when you use data from the past, it has its own biases. And how do you correct that in now what is the global encyclopedic data that's being used to train the new intelligences that have far-reaching implications for all societies around the world, and that's really scary. Now, I'm also interested in, how will the AI transcribe the blah, 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 blah. How are you spelling that? I don't know if the I don't know if the AI is going to be able to interpret that one.
Sorry.
No, I
Sorry
like
to
it.
the
I like it.
AI
And
overlord that is
I understood it. It was
yes.
a sparse representation of a very large body of data we don't have time to discuss right now.
Right, right,
Um
right, right.
so I do think that it is important to take like, why does this matter? This
Mhm,
matters because we have interest in future change, right?
mhm,
Like it isn't just that that the past is like we need an exact representation of the past, or we need the past to predict the patterns of the past to predict what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future. We shift that all the time, right? We had a
mhm,
pandemic. We learned from the pandemic, right? Like disease bad, just on a general idea, like less disease, yay. I realize that's also a complicated topic,
mhm,
um but like we learn from what's happened in the past and we shift behavior. And that is kind of in the essence of what we're trying to do in this context, so that we can weight the behavior and the answers that are going to come through this to be more beneficial. And then we get to like, to who? How do you decide that? Those kinds of things. But that's really what's the essence of this. Junmi.
So, I was just going to ask as we wrap up here, what would you say? Give me one or two examples of what our audience can do in practical terms to mitigate or navigate bias when they implement AI into their businesses or their daily lives.
So there are tools that will do that, right? So
Mhm,
there are plugins, there are features that will assess that. And depending on what your business model is, what you want to look for in your in your business opportunities, in your human resources, those sorts of things, like look for a tool that is that allows you to set the standards that you want, and not just like a blanket. But the other thing is to, I think, to start collecting data on on what really impacts value in your organization. Because I think research has shown a ton that diversity actually impacts your bottom line in a very positive way. And most data, most business data, is already biased too. Like what grows money is good, right? Just like on a general, what grows money, what grows value, what grows knowledge. And so just be super clear about that. Like collect the data and make those shifts in a way that will positively impact your business.
Yeah, on that point about diverse teams and or diverse companies, outperforming others. There's a very large study internally at Google about what the most high performance teams had as their, sort of DNA that made them so high performance compared to other teams within Google that didn't perform as well. And it was principally two things. One was, sufficient diversity of points of view in the team, and a culture within the team that accepted and encouraged the contribution of diverse points of view. You can imagine the stultification of a team
Right.
by a domineering leader who is saying, no, let's not even go there. That's not an angle we want to pursue, when in fact it's an expression of something that could actually give you a new, novel, lateral thinking kind of approach that would, improve
Right.
the outcomes by generating new possibilities. So that's important. I'm going to say, in response to your question, Jyunmi, that I'm concerned about the emergence of AI tutorial systems in education, and where the AI, has to make assessments of the student's performance, and those grades, if you will, it will have a lifelong impact on that particular human in the environment that now is the AIs are comprehending about their performance through the thing. And we know that teachers, human teachers who have a bias and who basically presume a certain capability or intellectual, quality in a certain student based on their own internal biases, will actually create the outcomes that they're expecting, right? Because in those interactions, like, just fast forward to the TLDR. I think that we have to get to some kind of super coding when it comes to education by AIs that says you have to do all the right positive things for every student, irrespective of, where you now interpret them to be, and bias, amelioration or bias remediation in educational systems has to be one of the first priorities.
Yeah, I
Really good
think
point.
that highlights an issue that definitely needs to more attention to. For me, I would say I think people should take a look at what their company mission is in the long term, right? So not just like you were saying, Beth, the whole like using the growth of economic value, or value of their how much evaluation is, and things like that, but more in what is the impact that your company is going to have in the long term. What is your overall goal when you've started your company? What was the overall goal you wanted? What was the impact, or what mark did you want your company to leave? And for most of the people that I've talked to, it's always started out as they wanted to provide some service or some general good for the populace. And I think AI kind of makes us go back and reflect upon that. And again, it goes back to that statement: is we got to start early, right? Get that literacy in there from the beginning, so it doesn't cause you a multiple or an exponential problem down the line. So, like for instance, Google. Remember your old saying, "Don't be evil." Why don't you reevaluate that a little bit? All right, that's all I got.
All right.
All right.
Well, thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Good discussion.
Yeah, thanks for joining the conversation today. Tomorrow we will be reviewing the Arc browser in the mobile app again, if you want to play along with us at home, go ahead and download that, and we'd love to have your participation in the conversation. Next week, we are talking about what if AI software companies made hardware? This is very cool. Go to LinkedIn and look at the images, or if you know that they point to a Twitter thread. Will AI change the Internet of Things forever? News, AI, and the future of work. That's a short topic. And then we're coming our bi-weekly recap show. So our circle back. Okay. Thanks. Happy Thursday. Hope you enjoyed. We'd love to hear from you. The Daily AI Show at gmail.com. Go rate us on Apple Podcasts and all the things that people say at the end of shows. Thanks. Have a good one.
That's the
Aloha.